At 2 in the morning, 17 Russian helicopters were sitting almost perfectly still at Berdyansk Airfield. Ka-52 attack helicopters and Mi-8 transports were lined up on the apron behind one of the strongest defensive shields Russia could put around them, an S-400 battery, short-range Pantsir protection, surveillance radar, and electronic warfare. On paper, reaching those helicopters should have been extremely difficult. But Ukraine had no intention of attacking them first. 6 small drones were already approaching low through the darkness, and each one had a different job. They weren't coming to destroy the helicopter fleet. They were coming to systematically remove everything that could protect it. And once the Russians realized what the drones were actually doing, 4 ballistic missiles would already be on their way. 14 minutes earlier, roughly 32 kilometers south of Berdyansk, 6 Ram 2-strike drones were launched into the darkness. These were not ordinary battlefield quadcopters, chasing individual soldiers or armored vehicles near the front. They were fixed-wing strike drones carrying relatively small explosive payloads, and that was enough for what Ukraine apparently needed them to do. Destroying an entire airbase was not their mission. Each drone only needed to damage one critical piece of equipment, one radar, one communications relay, one air defense vehicle. Ukraine was not trying to overpower the defensive network surrounding Berdyansk. It was attempting to dismantle that network piece by piece. The 6 drones moved toward the airfield at low altitude, reportedly around 80 meters above the ground, using the terrain and coastal clutter to make detection more difficult. Their small engines produced little warning compared with a missile or conventional aircraft. For several minutes, they remained difficult targets to identify. Then, at roughly 8 kilometers from the base, the approaching contacts finally appeared on Russian sensors. Multiple low and slow targets were moving north toward Berdyansk. The defenders now had only minutes to understand what they were seeing and decide how to respond. Russian electronic warfare systems began interfering with satellite navigation as the drones approached. Guidance became less reliable, and video feeds reportedly degraded into interference and broken images. One aircraft moved away from its intended corridor, but the formation continued forward. The drones could rely on preloaded navigation for much of the route, while operators only needed enough visual information during the final approach to make corrections. The jamming complicated the attack, but it did not stop it. Then the first drone changed altitude. Instead of flying toward the helicopters, sitting openly on the apron, it climbed several hundred meters and turned toward the airfield's surveillance radar. It rolled into a steep dive and struck the antenna. The explosion immediately damaged the system, responsible for providing much of the base's low-altitude picture. Within seconds, another drone followed, this time targeting the radar's supporting power and cooling equipment. That second strike mattered because even if the antenna itself could eventually be repaired, restoring the system would now require more than simply restarting it. Ukraine had attacked both the sensor and the infrastructure that allowed it to operate. The third drone went after an even more important target, the multifunction radar associated with the S-400 battery. The S-400 launchers could remain physically intact, their missiles still loaded and ready, but those weapons depended on sensors and fire control systems to identify targets and generate an engagement solution. The drone struck the radar complex, rather than wasting its small warhead against one of the launchers. In a matter of minutes, Ukraine was demonstrating the central weakness of any integrated air defense network. The missiles may be the most visible part of the system, but the sensors and communications connecting those missiles to the battlefield are what make them dangerous. A fourth drone attacked the communications relay. That strike threatened another layer of redundancy, because surviving elements of the Russian defense might otherwise have received targeting information from sensors operating elsewhere. Now, Berdyansk was not simply losing individual pieces of equipment. The connections between those pieces were also being attacked. Radar coverage was damaged, fire control capability was disrupted, communications were hit, yet there was still one system on the airfield capable of fighting back at close range. The Pantsir remained active. One Ukrainian drone approached the Pantsir on a relatively obvious path. The Russian crew detected it and engaged. An interceptor left the vehicle and destroyed the incoming drone several kilometers away. In isolation, it was exactly the result the Pantsir had been designed to produce. The threat appeared, the system tracked it, a missile was launched, and the target disappeared. But while the crew was dealing with that drone, another Ukrainian aircraft was already approaching from a different direction. That second drone was much closer. By the time the Pantsir crew attempted to respond, the target had moved into a far more difficult engagement position. The window for another missile interception was rapidly disappearing, forcing the crew toward the vehicle's guns. The barrels began rotating toward the approaching aircraft, but the distance was collapsing faster than the system could recover from the previous engagement. The drone continued directly toward the vehicle and struck it. The last immediate short-range defensive layer on the field had now been hit, and then something strange happened. Nothing attacked the helicopters. 17 Russian military helicopters were still sitting on the apron. Ka-52 gunships and Mi-8 transports remained where they had been before the first drone arrived. To personnel on the ground, the opening attack could have looked almost wasteful. Ukraine had sent multiple drones into a heavily defended airfield and used them against radar vehicles and communications equipment while leaving the most valuable aircraft untouched. But that was exactly why the attack was so dangerous. The drones were never supposed to destroy the helicopter fleet. Their job was to create a temporary hole in the defenses around it. Ukraine now needed that hole to remain open for only a few minutes. Russian personnel began reacting. Crews moved toward the helicopters. Covers came off. Engines began starting. Rotor blades slowly began turning as attempts were made to move aircraft away from the exposed flight line. But evacuating 17 military helicopters under normal conditions would take coordination. Doing it while radar equipment and air defense vehicles were burning around the airfield was something entirely different. Ukraine had reportedly left roughly 6 minutes between the suppression of those defensive systems and the next phase of the attack. It was long enough to confirm that critical parts of the shield had been damaged, but short enough to make recovery extremely difficult. Russian personnel could attempt to restart systems, move equipment, or launch helicopters, but they could not rebuild an integrated defensive network in minutes. Then, approximately 135 kilometers away, 4 launchers came alive. 4 ATACMS ballistic missiles lifted into the night, several seconds apart. Their launch vehicles could begin leaving their firing positions almost immediately, but the missiles had only one destination: Berdyansk. This was the weapon the S-400 had been positioned to stop. Regional Russian sensors could still detect a ballistic threat approaching the area, but detecting an incoming missile somewhere in the network and successfully engaging it over the airfield were two very different things. The local systems Ukraine had just attacked were the systems needed to turn warning into action. The missiles were closing fast. Below them, 17 helicopters were still sitting inside the target area, and the Russian crews had only minutes left before they discovered why Ukraine had spent the opening phase of the operation attacking everything except the opening aircraft. The 4 ATACMS missiles were now racing toward Berdyansk, traveling fast enough that the Russians had almost no time to recover from what had just happened. Under normal circumstances, this was exactly the kind of incoming threat the S-400 was supposed to confront, but the launchers sitting near the airfield were only one part of that defensive system. The radar and communications infrastructure needed to turn those missiles into an effective response had already been hit. The weapons were still there. The defensive network around them was not functioning the way it had only minutes earlier. Farther away, Russian radar reportedly detected the 4 ballistic tracks and generated a warning. But warning the airfield and actually producing an interception were two different problems. The local radar needed to help create an engagement picture had been damaged. The communications relay had been struck. The Pantsir had also been hit. 4 missiles were now crossing the same airspace that had been heavily protected only minutes before, and nothing rose from the airfield to stop them. Then the first ATACMS reached the target area. It opened above the northern section of the apron, where the Ka-52 attack helicopters had been positioned. Instead of producing one concentrated explosion, its payload dispersed hundreds of submunitions across the area below. In seconds, fragmentation swept across aircraft that had been parked close together. Helicopters designed to operate over dangerous battlefields were now stationary targets, with little protection against an attack spreading across the entire flight line. Seconds later, another missile opened over the section containing Mi-8 transport helicopters. A third targeted the maintenance and support area, hitting vehicles and equipment needed to keep the airfield functioning. Fuel trucks, towing equipment, and other support assets were suddenly caught inside the strike zone. The attack was no longer focused only on destroying aircraft. It was also damaging the infrastructure that could have helped crews respond to the fires spreading across the base. Then the 4th missile reached the aviation ammunition area. That strike changed the situation again. Explosions continued after the initial missile attack as ammunition and other material in the area began reacting to the fires. Burning fuel spread beneath damaged aircraft. Onboard weapons reportedly began cooking off, producing additional explosions and forcing personnel away from parts of the flight line. What had begun minutes earlier as a small drone attack against several carefully selected defensive targets had now become a much larger destruction zone. The important part was the sequence. Ukraine had not attempted to overwhelm every Russian defensive system simultaneously. The opening drones had been used against specific nodes: surveillance, fire control, communications, and short-range protection. Only after those systems had been disrupted did the ballistic missiles arrive, and that sequencing created a problem much larger than the destruction at Berdyansk itself. Because if a heavily defended airfield could be temporarily exposed by attacking a small number of critical components, then every other base relying on a similar defensive architecture suddenly had to consider the same question: not whether its missiles were powerful enough, but whether the network allowing those missiles to fight could survive the opening minutes of the next attack. By the time the missiles were gone, the attack itself had lasted only minutes, but the destruction they left behind continued long afterward. Fires spread across the flight line, damaged aircraft burned beside one another, and explosions reportedly continued from the ammunition area deep into the night. The support equipment that might normally have helped crews contain the damage had itself been caught in the strike. What had been a functioning military airfield before 2 in the morning was now dealing with multiple fires, damaged defensive systems, destroyed equipment, and a helicopter fleet caught almost completely exposed on the ground. By first light, the scale of the damage was becoming clearer. 17 helicopters had reportedly been positioned on the apron before the strike. Afterward, several burned areas could be seen where aircraft had been parked. But the significance of Berdyansk was never limited to a simple count of destroyed helicopters. The more important story was how Ukraine had created the conditions that allowed the heavier strike to reach the airfield in the first place. The opening drones carried only small warheads. Individually, none had the destructive power of the ballistic missiles that followed. But they did not need it. Their targets had been selected according to function rather than size. Instead of trying to destroy every S-400 launcher, the attack went after radar and supporting infrastructure. Instead of throwing multiple drones directly at the Pantsir, one threat forced the system to react, while another approached. During the resulting engagement window, the communications relay was targeted because an air defense battery isolated from the wider network becomes far less capable even if some of its individual components survive. That is what made the sequence so effective in this account of the attack. The Russian defensive shield was not necessarily defeated by a larger or more expensive defensive system. Critical parts of it were disrupted long enough for another weapon to exploit the opening, and that distinction matters far beyond Berdyansk. Modern air defense depends on layers. Long-range systems protect against threats farther away. Short-range systems defend those larger batteries from drones and low-flying weapons. Radars provide detection. Communications connect those sensors to command posts and launchers. Electronic warfare attempts to interfere with incoming weapons. Each layer is designed to support the others, but interconnected defenses also create dependencies. Remove the right sensor, and a launcher can lose the information it needs. Break a communications link, and one part of the network can become isolated from another. Force a short-range system to concentrate on one threat, and another may suddenly have an opportunity to penetrate. Berdyansk demonstrated the danger of that chain being attacked in sequence. 6 small drones reportedly opened the operation. 4 ballistic missiles delivered the destructive follow-up. Between them was a window measured in minutes. That window was enough to transform an airfield protected by sophisticated Russian defenses into a target the incoming missiles could reach. And, for Russian commanders, the most uncomfortable question may not have been what happened at Berdyansk. It was how many other bases depended on the same basic architecture. Because, after an operation like this, every radar position, communications vehicle, short-range defense system, and concentrated aircraft parking area becomes part of the calculation. If you want more breakdowns that focus not only on what was hit, but on the tactics, sequencing, and battlefield decisions behind these operations, subscribe to and stay with us. Modern warfare is changing quickly, and sometimes the most important weapon in an attack isn't the one that delivers the final explosion. It's the one that quietly removes the shield first.